Executives love looking at the artificial intelligence screen. The answer appears instantly. The dashboard looks clean. The demo feels magical. The vendor says the model is powerful. The board hears productivity, automation, savings, and transformation. But here is the part nobody wants to say out loud. The screen is not the system. The model is not the full risk. The chatbot is not the full liability. Behind every artificial intelligence output is a physical machine. Chips, servers, data centers, power, cooling, water, carbon, cloud contracts, cyber controls, supply chains, and cost. If your artificial intelligence audit stops at the screen, it is not an artificial intelligence audit. It is a performance review of the visible layer, while the real liability runs behind the wall. If artificial intelligence is the front-facing accountability layer, infrastructure is the hidden liability layer. The front end creates the headline, a biased decision, a bad recommendation, a hallucinated answer, a failed agent, a customer harm event. But the back end creates the capacity, cost, resilience, security, environmental, and dependency footprint. The chips decide capability. The data centers decide availability. The power grid decides continuity. The cooling system decides density. The water supply decides community exposure. The cloud contract decides control. The vendor stack decides dependency. The logs decide evidence. And the audit trail decides accountability. This is the new reality. You cannot govern artificial intelligence if you refuse to audit the machine that makes it possible. Start with chips, not as procurement parts, as capability gates. The graphics processing unit, the GPU, is not just hardware, it is the engine of scale. It determines what models can run, how fast they run, how expensive they are, who gets priority, and who gets left behind. Boards need chip accountability. Where did the chips come from? Are they traceable? Are they authorized? Are they restricted? Are firmware and drivers patched? Are workloads dependent on one chip supplier? Are expensive accelerators being used efficiently, or are they sitting underutilized while leadership declares victory on artificial intelligence transformation? Here is the blunt question. If the enterprise cannot explain its compute stack, it cannot explain its artificial intelligence risk. Next, the data center. The data center is the factory behind artificial intelligence, not a metaphor, a factory. It consumes power, generates heat, requires cooling, needs security, depends on networks, faces outages, and carries physical limitations. Boards must ask, where does the artificial intelligence workload run? Which data centers host training? Which host inference? Where are logs stored? Where are backups replicated? Can the facility handle high-density artificial intelligence racks? What happens when demand spikes? What happens when cooling fails? What happens when the region goes down? What happens when the vendor throttles capacity? If the company promises artificial intelligence at scale, the board must know whether the data center backbone can actually carry the promise. Otherwise, the enterprise is selling ambition on top of infrastructure fragility. Power is no longer a utility footnote. Power is an artificial intelligence control point. No electricity, no artificial intelligence. No grid capacity, no scale, no reliable energy, no uptime, no power economics, no return on investment. Boards must audit power dependency. What power contracts support the artificial intelligence workload? Are costs fixed, floating, or passed through? Are renewable claims real or just accounting optics? Can grid constraints delay growth? Can backup generation increase emissions? Can local communities push back? Can power scarcity force the vendor to reprice, throttle, or prioritize larger customers? This is where the digital fantasy hits the physical world. The model may be virtual. The electricity bill is not. And the power constraint may decide who gets to scale. Now the part that rarely makes the executive slide. Cooling and water. Artificial intelligence workloads create dense heat. Dense heat requires serious cooling. Cooling requires energy. And in many systems, cooling requires water. So boards must ask, what cooling method is used? Air cooling, liquid cooling, direct-to-chip cooling, immersion cooling, chilled water? Can the facility support higher rack density? How much water is used? Where is the water coming from? Is the region water stressed? Are communities affected? Are claims measured or estimated? Is the enterprise selling responsible artificial intelligence while ignoring physical resource impact? That is not responsibility. That is selective disclosure. And selective disclosure becomes dangerous when regulators, investors, customers, or communities start asking better questions. Artificial intelligence also creates environmental, social, and governance exposure. ESG is not just branding when the infrastructure burns power at scale. Artificial intelligence can affect Scope 2 emissions from purchased electricity. It can affect Scope 3 emissions through cloud providers, co-location providers, chip manufacturing, hardware supply chains, and outsourced compute. Boards must ask, are carbon claims auditable? Are green energy claims real? Are water claims defensible? Are cloud emissions visible? Are chip supply chain impacts included? Are customers being told the truth? Are investors getting a complete risk picture? The warning is simple. Do not market clean artificial intelligence while hiding dirty infrastructure. That is how reputation risk becomes legal risk. Cybersecurity does not stop at prompt injection. The infrastructure can compromise the model. Cloud identity, data pipelines, firmware, drivers, accelerators, model weights, inference logs, embeddings, backup storage, deployment pipelines, management consoles, physical access. Every layer is an attack surface. Boards need to know who can access the model, who can access the logs, who can move the weights, who can change the pipeline, who can see the prompts, who can copy the data, who can disable the system, who can hide the incident. If you cannot trace the infrastructure event, you cannot explain the artificial intelligence incident. That is the cybersecurity reality. Now let's talk money. The return on investment story can collapse when infrastructure costs are hidden. Artificial intelligence may reduce labor hours. But what does each inference cost? What does each agent action cost? What does each automated workflow cost? What does each customer interaction cost? What is training spend versus inference spend? What is experimentation waste? What is storage cost? What are overages? What are cloud commitments? What happens when usage scales? What happens when the vendor raises prices? What happens when the public market demands margin? Do not let artificial intelligence savings get celebrated in one budget while compute, power, cooling, and cloud costs explode in another. That is not transformation. That is cost migration with better marketing. Most enterprises do not own the full artificial intelligence stack. They depend on vendors, cloud providers, co-location facilities, chip suppliers, cooling vendors, power partners, software platforms, managed service providers, sub-processors. That does not eliminate accountability. It multiplies the audit problem. Can you audit the vendor? Can you obtain infrastructure evidence? Can you see data center regions? Can you verify data flows? Can you test failover? Can you validate security controls? Can you control price exposure? Can you exit? Can you move the workload? Or does the vendor hold the evidence while you hold the liability? That is the governance illusion. If the vendor controls the infrastructure evidence and the buyer has no audit rights, the buyer does not have control. The buyer has trust dressed up as governance. The board needs an artificial intelligence infrastructure audit map, compute inventory, data center location, power source, cooling method, water usage, carbon reporting, cybersecurity controls, data flows, vendor obligations, financial controls, resilience, board reporting. Every serious artificial intelligence deployment should answer, what runs it? Where does it run? Who controls it? What does it cost? What happens if it fails? What happens if it overheats? What happens if power is constrained? What happens if the vendor changes terms? What happens if the regulator asks for evidence? What happens if the customer asks for proof? The board does not need every engineering detail, but it absolutely needs visibility into dependency, cost, resilience, and accountability. In the AIPOC.AI red zone, identify infrastructure exposure. Which chips, which cloud, which data center, which power source, which cooling system, which water source, which data flows, which vendors, which geography, which logs, which resilience plan, which environmental claims, which contract rights. Red zone means forcing the enterprise to admit the truth. There is no artificial intelligence without infrastructure exposure, no visibility, no control, no defense. In the AIPOC.AI yellow zone, prove before scale. Stress test capacity, audit power assumptions, validate cooling limits, review water impact, confirm carbon claims, verify data center resilience, validate cost per inference, confirm vendor audit rights, test failover, review chip and cloud concentration, check cybersecurity logging, run business continuity exercises. Do not scale artificial intelligence on assumption. Do not scale on vendor confidence. Do not scale on a demo. Scale only when the infrastructure can prove it is controlled, resilient, and auditable. No infrastructure proof, no artificial intelligence scale. In the AIPOC.AI green zone, govern the stack. Maintain an artificial intelligence infrastructure inventory. Create a board-visible dependency dashboard. Monitor usage and cost. Track power and cooling metrics. Track carbon and water impact. Maintain vendor evidence rights. Require cybersecurity logs. Test incident response. Validate capacity planning. Build fallback architecture. Secure exit rights. Retest periodically. Green means the enterprise can prove that artificial intelligence is supported by controlled, resilient, auditable infrastructure. Not hope, not hype, not vendor theater. Proof. Here is the hard warning. The enterprise cannot put artificial intelligence in front of the board and leave the infrastructure in the basement. That era is over. Artificial intelligence accountability is not just about the model. It is about the machine behind the model. The front-end artificial intelligence may be where the harm becomes visible, but the back-end infrastructure is where the hidden risk accumulates. If the audit ignores chips, data centers, power, cooling, water, carbon, cybersecurity, vendors, costs, resilience, and evidence rights, then the audit is incomplete. Worse than incomplete. Misleading. And misleading audits become dangerous when regulators, investors, customers, and plaintiffs start asking real questions. So audit the model, but govern the stack. Because the liability is not only in what the artificial intelligence says, the liability is also in what it consumes, where it runs, who controls it, what it costs, and whether the enterprise can prove it. For more hard-hitting executive briefings on artificial intelligence governance, infrastructure accountability, audit risk, vendor exposure, procurement strategy, and 2030 readiness, visit the YouTube channel AIPOC Powered and go to www.aipoc.ai.